One of the first distinctions we need to make when studying how communication works is the difference between verbal and non-verbal communication. It should be pretty apparent to most of us that verbal communication describes the sounds that come out of our mouths and the way that we interpret those sounds into words and sentences that have meaning. But perhaps less well understood are the parts of communication which are non-verbal. Just a few of those systems of non-verbal communication that we use and that are studied widely include things like haptics, which is our sense of touch, kinesics, which is our body movement, vocalics, which is our use of tone and volume to convey meaning in what we're saying, and finally, a study called proxemics, or the human use of space. Proxemics is a really fun way to look at how culture influences communication because one's proxemic behavior is very strongly influenced by the culture that an individual is raised in, was brought up in. But let's wind back a little bit and talk about what proxemics actually is first. Edward T. Hall developed the early theory of proxemics in the 1960s, and he was trying to describe how humans have different uses of space or comfort zones, and how those levels of comfort zones communicate information about the level of relationship between two people. In his research, Hall described 4 levels of space that exist, ranging from intimate space, which is kind of the few centimeters right up close to us, the space in which we might whisper something to an intimate partner or have close communication with people who are very close to us, ranging through to a broader personal space in which we might have a conversation with friends, a social space in which we might interact with acquaintances or people at work in the community, and finally a public space, which is kind of a few meters, which we might use to communicate information to a big audience, like a public lecture hall. Mixing up the use of these spaces could lead to drastic social consequences. I mean, if you imagine giving a public lecture 5 centimeters from someone's face, or whispering something intimate to a partner from 10 meters away, these kinds of things are generally not socially accepted, and they're demonstrations of how we have different levels of space in which we use different types of communication. You might notice as well that these layers are closely aligned to the course concepts we use of micro, meso, and macro levels of interaction in a society. In fact, proxemics is a really helpful tool in helping us decipher the nature of communications between individuals and at what level of society an interaction is occurring. One difficulty with proxemics is that not every country or culture has the same idea about how close is too close for a personal interaction. Some cultures use really wide proxemic norms, and other countries use really close proxemic norms. 2 extremes of this are probably a Finnish culture in Northern Europe and Southern Italian culture. Now, the Finns maintain a large social distance between one another as a cultural norm, and Southern Italians maintain a very close cultural difference. So it's very common for people who are not that well acquainted to stand close to one another in Southern Italy, where that would not be common at all in Finland. In fact, one thing that became apparent during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic is that proxemics would have an impact on communication around public safety and on how close we could expect people to stand in public. When public information campaigns went up in Finland, telling people to stand 1.5 meters from others in public, the response was, of course, why would you stand closer than 1.5 meters to a stranger in public? Whereas in other countries, that came as a shock or a new way of life. So proxemics can have a real impact on the way we interact with people in our community. Proxemics introduced the idea of personal space into the mainstream, and you've all heard it now in public about inviting people into your personal space, or we describe how we have control over our personal space when we interact with others in society. But I'd like you to think about how you define your own personal boundaries, or how closely you allow people to communicate to you. Is it something that you think is given to you by your family? Is it largely influenced by your community, your culture, or your nation? How do you think you decide how closely you let people communicate with you?